And get started. As mentioned in chat, yes, this is the last in-scope lecture for the semester. So if you're only concerned about, learning the material that will be tested on the exam, then I believe this should be your last lecture. But if you are interested in more crypto and more buffer overflows and learning how you can apply them to Super Mario Bros. 3, then you should come to the optional lectures that are next week. So depending on your focus for the class, this may or may not be the end, as someone in chat mentioned. I just went ahead and fixed the lecture number because we managed to mess that up again. We can talk about Signal after the lecture, or after today. It is the lecture on Monday, but yeah. Anywho, some announcements for the last time. Homework 7 is going to be due next Monday. Project 3 was released earlier this week. It's due next Tuesday. It's on the shorter end of our 3 projects. So I know it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but not to say you should procrastinate on it, but please don't feel too stressed about the fact that it's due in less than a week. Project 2 is due Friday, so that's due tomorrow. We extended it from Tuesday based on student feedback. But yeah, try to get that in as soon as you can. The final exam is going to be next Thursday. So we sent out a conflict form in the announcements for this week. Please fill that out if you aren't able to make this time, and we'll work with you to schedule an alternate time. Finally, Lab 1 and 2, they were released. They are due next Wednesday. If you want to submit them after the final, we won't stop you. Again, the lab grade will be replaced by your homework grade or your project grade, whichever is higher, and your homework grade is almost definitely 100%. So it doesn't matter that much when you submit it. We just need to put a formal due date on it. And finally, our review sessions are going to happen next week in review for the final. The worksheets associated with them will be released soon, TM. Oh yes, and as I mentioned, today's lecture is the last lecture that's formally in scope. Next week's lectures are out of scope, but I think they're fun. I think they're the most fun lectures of the entire semester, so you should definitely come out if you think you can spare the time. All right, so last time we talked about malware. Malware is really just any bad code that is running on a computer that it's not supposed to run on. Generally, these come into large classes that replicate themselves. Either they require user to do something, so that's something like a virus that you have to click on an email or something, or a worm, which just spreads on its own. It just goes, and usually it exploits some vulnerability to automatically spread. In terms of detection, usually we rely on signature-based detection, which we talked about 2 days ago. Antivirus software will generally just flag any unfamiliar code. So either a virus has to stay the same and then be vulnerable to signature detection, or it has to change, but then it will be unfamiliar and then it'll be flagged. So either way, we've sort of got malware in a bind so that the attacker has a problem either way. In terms of propagation, if the virus does change itself, either it usually encrypts itself with a different key each time. We call this polymorphic code, or it'll actually just change the code itself such that it has the same behavior, even if it has slightly different, registers or something. So this is called metamorphic code. This helps it to avoid signature-based detection. But again, if we are flagging unfamiliar code, we put it in a bind, and this doesn't help it that much. When you are infected with malware, generally the best option is just to nuke your entire computer and start from scratch. Maybe you don't have to throw out your hardware, although there are attacks that will literally infect the hardware that your computer is running on, and there's not much you can actually do to get it off. But when you're dealing with something like rootkits, which tamper with the operating system itself, it's hard to verify that you're back into a working state without the presence of malware. So generally the best option is just to nuke everything and restart. All right, that was last time. Today we are talking about Tor. So we will talk about anonymity. What is anonymity? We'll talk about proxies and VPNs, because I know a lot of people have heard a lot of things about both of those. We'll go into the actual function of Tor. We'll talk about some of its weaknesses and some of the things that it doesn't defend against. We'll talk briefly about onion services, which used to be called hidden services, but we won't spend too much time on that because it's kind of complicated. And then we'll talk about how Tor is used in practice. So, anonymity. We've heard this word before. We've sort of thrown it around. We've talked about anonymity and how it's not security. So remember, security is enforcing properties that we want, even if there's an attacker present. Anonymity is actually pretty different. Anonymity is really just making sure that your identity is concealed. If I were to be anonymous in this lecture, you would not know who I am. I might disguise my voice. I might hide my IP address so that you don't know who's talking to you. But that would probably be weird, and Berkeley might get mad at me for that, so I won't do that. On the internet, when we're talking about the internet, we basically want to conceal the identity of the source or the destination. So either someone is talking to a server, but the server doesn't know who that someone is, or we're talking to some server out there, but no one knows who that server actually is. It's not confidentiality. So we could have unencrypted data, but you still can't tie that data to a certain individual. So they're sort of related to each other in that confidentiality can help with anonymity, but they're not the same thing. All right, on the internet, anonymity is hard. It's really difficult, if not impossible. I think it might actually literally be impossible to achieve anonymity if you are literally by yourself, if you only have a single internet connection and you can't ask anyone to help you. This is because of how the internet works. So packets have to contain the source IP address so that people know who is talking to them and so that they can respond. If we're dealing with attackers, it becomes a little bit easier for them since they can hack into someone else's computer and then they are sort of sending communications from that computer rather than their own computer. But you know, we're assuming that most people aren't going to go and hack someone else's computer in order to achieve anonymity. That is somewhat illegal and definitely not a recommended approach to anonymity. The main strategy for us is going to be asking someone else to send messages for us. So I know when David Wagner, one of the other professors for this course, not other professors, one of the other instructors for this course, when he taught this class, we did this exercise where people will send a message to someone else and then they'll send that message in chat. But I don't think we have enough people for that. And I fear that that would just get awkward because not enough people will do it. So maybe at the end we can try it just for fun. But the main strategy that we're going to rely upon is asking someone else to send messages for us. So this gets us into the relatively simple, at least relatively before we get into Tor, idea of proxies and VPN. So a proxy is just asking someone else to send a message on our behalf. So let's say Alice wants to send a message to Bob, but we want to make sure that Bob doesn't know that it's Alice that this message is coming from. Bob just sees that a message is coming from, you know, someone. We also want to make sure that an eavesdropper, let's say there's an eavesdropper that's listening to everything Alice says, and we want to make sure that they can't tell that Alice is talking to Bob. All they see is that Alice is talking to, you know, someone, but they don't know. This proxy is going to be a man in the middle, but not in the bad way, not necessarily in the bad way, that relays our internet traffic for us. So instead of Alice sending a message directly to Bob, in which case Bob would see, oh, I'm receiving a message from Alice, and Eve would see, oh, Alice is sending a message to Bob, we're going to send our message to a third party. So Alice is going to send her message, not to Bob, but to the proxy. And then this proxy gets this message and sees, oh, okay, you want me to send this message to Bob, I'll just do that for you. The recipient's name is inside this message. So if you look at this diagram here, we see we have our message and part of this has to say, please send this to Bob, because otherwise the proxy wouldn't know where to send the message to. But this outer message, which is what Eve can see because the innards are encrypted, is just that Alice is talking to the proxy and not talking to Bob. So when the proxy gets this message, the proxy will decrypt it. And now the proxy knows, oh, this message is being sent to Bob. And then the proxy will create their own message saying from proxy to Bob, and then this message will be unencrypted and just sent to Bob directly. So notice Bob only sees from proxy, and an eavesdropper here only sees to proxy, not to Bob. So we've achieved some level of anonymity here, although it's not as great. And yeah, as I mentioned, Bob receives the message from the proxy, not from Alice. This is okay. But we'll get into some of the issues with this shortly. And some of you parents telling me that my connection's cutting out. I keep forgetting to do this. Give me one quick moment to fix this. All right. Oh, hello. Can you still hear me? Just making sure. Okay. I got a thumbs up from Perrin. Speaking of VPNs, I'm connected to a VPN. And now I will explain exactly what a VPN is after I make this full screen. All right. All right. So a related but a distinct topic is a virtual private network, a VPN. So we talked about this briefly when we talked about firewalls, but we'll just recap it briefly. So VPNs are basically a virtual connection to some other internal network. So if I have let's say I want to connect to Berkeley's internal network, but I'm not physically at Berkeley, I can connect to a VPN, and this basically emulates, you can think of it like a really long Ethernet cable that at one end is connected to my computer and at the other end is connected directly to Berkeley's network. But this is actually emulated through software through a VPN. So the thing to notice is that this allows access to an internal network through some sort of encrypted tunnel. And if you squint at this hard enough, you'll start to realize this is really similar to the idea of a proxy. It creates the alternative use case of, instead of just communicating with the servers inside the internal network, I can just communicate as though I'm coming from that internal network itself. So I can if I connect to Berkeley's network through a VPN, I also happen to gain the ability of appearing as though my traffic is coming from Berkeley rather than coming from my real IP address. So again, it's a similar concept, but the key here is that Alice is sending packets as if she's coming from the VPN. And then as she sends these packets, it's wrapped in the VPN's layer of encryption itself. The other way you can think about it is that proxies operate at the application level. So you have to implement it as HTTP, or sometimes there will be other protocols that come into play. But VPNs operate at the network layer itself. So Alice is connected to the VPN network, and she's sending messages as if she's in the VPN network. It's just that those packets have to go through an additional hop before they're actually sent out into the wider internet. So that's sort of what I've encapsulated in this diagram here. We have this message, although it's encrypted in this red box here. And Alice is herself writing the message from VPN to Bob. It's just that it's getting forwarded to the VPN, unwrapped, and then actually sent from the VPN to Bob. So it's a subtle difference. And for most intents and purposes, it's pretty much the same. But I just thought I'd elaborate on that difference a little bit because I know VPN is a word that gets thrown around in marketing a lot lately. All right, so with both proxies and VPNs, we have a couple of issues. First of all is maybe the most obvious one, but we have a performance impact. Because we're sending a packet to someone else before we send it to the final destination, you have to hop around the internet a little bit more, and that can be slower because I have to, have more hops on the internet. There is a monetary cost associated generally with these services as well. So if you're paying for a VPN service or a proxy service, they need some way of making money. So VPNs can generally cost around $80 to $200 per year. There are free ones, but those are dubious because if they're not making money through charging you, they're probably making money through selling your data. So those can be dubious at best. And I guess as we just got into, you have to trust the proxy itself. Notice in the previous diagram for both the VPN and the proxy that the VPN knows both who Alice is and who Bob is. So you have to trust the proxy that they won't just sell your data and say, hey, look, Alice is talking to Bob, because the proxies or the VPN can see both of these parties. The attacker might also just convince the proxy to tell you their identity. So I guess this has to do with trust as well, but they could say bribe your VPN or your proxy to give away their data, or someone like the national government could say, you have to give us your data or we're going to shut you down in the interests of national security, so to speak. So we still have a layer of trust here. Because of this, we don't say that proxies and VPNs are anonymous if you don't trust the proxy or the VPN. And whether you trust the proxy or the VPN is dependent on your threat model. But if you don't trust anyone, you can't say that proxies and VPNs are anonymous because they hold basically the keys to your identity. All right, questions on proxies and VPNs so far? All right. And let's talk about Tor. Let's see how we can fix this. So the idea previously was just send our traffic to one person, and then that one person will forward it on to our final destination. But that one person ended up having information about both us and who we're talking to. So the simplest idea, and the idea that we're actually going to dig into with the Tor project, is send packets through multiple proxies instead of just one proxy. And this brings us to Tor itself. Tor uses multiple proxies, and we're going to call them relays for the rest of this lecture, in order to enable anonymous communications. Tor stands for the onion router, so TOR, the onion router. We'll see why the word onion is used here shortly, but the gist of it is that Tor has layers and onions have layers, so the onion router. There are several components to Tor itself. So there's the Tor network, which is the network of all the relays or proxies that you could possibly use. There's going to be a directory server that is just a list of all the Tor relays and all of their public keys. You need this just because you need to know what relays are out there. There's an actual browser that is configured to connect to the Tor network by default. It's based on Firefox, and it has some tweaks to it to improve its anonymity properties. There's also called something called onion services. They used to be called hidden services, but these are servers that are only accessible through the Tor network. You can't connect to them through a regular web browser. And we'll go briefly into how those work, but it's out of scope for this semester. And finally, we have bridges. So these are relays, except they are only used to hide the fact that someone is connecting to Tor. And we'll get into how those work as well. All right. First, before we construct any system, we always have to define our threat model. So first thing we want is security. We want to make sure that the client, in this case, is anonymous. And we want to make it such that even if people are trying to prevent someone from connecting to the internet or connecting to certain sites, that users are able to do this anyway. We call the attempt at preventing accessing certain sites censorship, and the defense against that censorship resistance, because you're resisting censorship. We have this optional feature of server anonymity, so not just protecting the identity of the client, but also protecting the identity of the server. This is achieved through onion services, and again, we'll get into that later, but it's not something that's built into the Tor network, it's something that's built on top of it. Something else we want it to be low latency. So there are certain defenses that are just like, send your network packet, and then 100 seconds later, I'll send it onwards, and then it's really hard to tell if that packet was yours. But that's, no one wants to use something that will take 100 seconds just to connect to a single website. So we want some sort of performance out of our Tor network rather than, the ultimate security. Tor is going to preserve our anonymity, and the important part here is against local adversaries. So for example, if we have an on-path attacker that's, say, between Alice and her internet service provider, and she sends a message to the Tor relay, the on-path attacker should be able to see this, or not should be able to see this, but can see this, but we want to make sure that they don't know who Alice is really talking to. On the other end of that is that the server should not know the identity of the client. So if the server receives some network packet, the server shouldn't know who that network packet came from. So all of these are local adversaries because they're located in one single point and can only see a part of the network traffic. We'll get into what a global adversary looks like shortly. I realize I've just been saying that for like the last 10 slides, but it's okay. Okay, so the first thing that we need out of our network is something called a circuit. Remember, we want to form a connection with multiple relays. So we need to figure out what our relays are actually going to be. And we say that these 3 relays are going to form something called a circuit. So how do we actually form this circuit? Step 1, we need to ask the directory server, hey, I need a list of relays because I want to connect to the Tor network. Once we have a list of relays, we're going to just choose 3 of them. So we say, okay, I want 1 relay in, say, the United States. Maybe I want 1 relay in the UK, and I want 1 relay in, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a country but I'm realizing that I have opinions on many countries. So let's just say I want a third relay in, I don't know, Germany, which is also in the EU, but it's okay. And I'm just going to choose those relays to form my circuit. Once I've chosen them, I'm going to connect to the first one, and I'm going to perform a TLS handshake with them. So remember that TLS provides confidentiality and integrity on your connection. And because I have the public keys from the directory, I can secure this TLS using certificates and something similar. So once I've connected to that first relay, what I'm going to do is through that first relay, I'm going to form a end-to-end TLS connection with the second relay. So what I'm doing is I'm sending my packets to the first relay. The first relay is decrypting them and saying, oh, these are handshake packets. I'm just going to forward them on to the second relay. And then the client and the second relay are going to form an end-to-end tunnel through the first relay. So the first relay in this case could act as a man in the middle in this second TLS connection, but because we're using TLS, we're assuming that they can't man in the middle of this connection. Once we've done that, we're just going to do the same thing with the third relay. So through the first relay, through the second relay, we're going to form an end-to-end connection with the third relay. And in this case, we notice that the second relay could act as a man in the middle with our third relay when we're doing the TLS handshake. But again, because we're using TLS, we're assuming that they can't really do that without breaking some hard math problem out there. Finally, through the third relay, we're going to connect to the web server. And the thing to notice is that if the web server is using HTTPS, we're going to do an additional end-to-end TLS handshake with the third relay itself. All right, I know that's a lot of words, but we're going to get into a diagram, which will hopefully clear questions up if you have them. So step 0, Alice wants to talk to Bob. Step 1, Alice queries the directory server, and she's going to choose 3 relays. So let's just say she's chosen this one here, and this one here. Doesn't really matter which ones she's chosen as long as they're random, basically. Alice first forms a TLS connection with this first relay node. So I have sort of drawn what is an attempt at a tunnel here, and that's supposed to signify that this is an encrypted connection. Any eavesdropper here can't see what this traffic actually says, only that it's going between Alice and this first relay. Now, through this first relay, she's going to form a TLS connection with the second relay. So the way this works is Alice sends her packets to the first relay. These packets get decrypted and get sent to the second relay. So Alice is ultimately still the one performing the TLS handshake with the second relay. It just happens that her packets are being routed through the first relay and through an additional layer of encryption first. All right. Now yes, and layer 1 is only relaying the TLS packets, and that's sort of signified by this end-to-end tunnel here that's in orange. This relay can't actually see the contents of this tunnel, only that the relay is forwarding on TLS packets. All right, and then we do it again. So Alice is still the one performing the TLS handshake. It's just that she's relaying her packets through the first and second relay, and then she does a handshake with this green relay here. And finally, once these 3 handshakes are done, she's going to form her actual connection to the server. So it's traveling through this tunnel and through this tunnel and then through this tunnel. And ultimately, when this relay receives the packet, it sees, okay, these packets ultimately get forwarded on to Bob. Again, if Bob speaks TLS, then you might have an additional handshake as this blue tunnel, but we're going to just abstract that away as Alice and Bob have some way of communicating. All right. So what do these relays actually do? Let's think about for a moment what logic the relays have to have in order to be able to sustain these connections. Well, we know that relays are going to perform TLS handshakes. So if it receives packets from somewhere that says, hello, I would like to perform a TLS handshake, then you perform the TLS handshake. When you receive a packet and it's not a handshake packet, then you're going to take the packet and decrypt it with whatever key you have changed through TLS. So there are a lot of packets flying around, but any packet that comes to me, I'm assuming is associated with some TLS connection that I've formed, and I have the key and I can decrypt it. Once I decrypt it, if I see, oh, the destination for this packet is just another relay, just send it on to that relay. They'll handle it from there. If I see, oh, the destination of this packet is actually an external server, then I'm just going to forward the packet to that server. So notice I didn't know who the destination was until I decrypted the packet in TLS. So we've sort of got nesting of different destinations here, and that's going to be important for our security guarantees. Does Tor do this with DNS as well? That's a good question. I believe it does. Oh, it almost definitely does, because otherwise you could de-anonymize who you're talking to. But yeah, I can loop back around to that question in more depth in a moment. So let's look at how Alice actually communicates with Bob. We know that we have these layers of tunnels going on, and we know that Alice knows all 3 keys, and each relay only knows its key because it only participated in one of the TLS handshakes, whereas Alice participated in all of the TLS handshakes. So Alice has all the keys. She's going to take her packet to Bob. Let's just say it says hello world. She's going to encrypt it with K3, then encrypt it with K2, then encrypt it with K1. So you can start to see this is how we got our layer metaphor earlier, because Tor packets have layers and onions have layers, thus the Tor router. Once this packet is fully encrypted, Alice is going to send this along to the first relay. The first relay has K1, so it can decrypt this outer red layer and see, oh, this is just a packet and it's meant to be sent to relay 2. It doesn't know that inside that is relay 3. It just knows, oh, the 2 header on this is relay 2, so I should forward it on to them. It strips that layer, and now relay 2 says, okay, I have the K2 key, and I can decrypt this second layer here. So it decrypts it and sees, oh, this packet is meant to go to relay 3. So I'm just going to forward it on to them. This relay has K3, so it can decrypt this green layer, and it sees, oh, this packet is meant to go to Bob, so it's going to forward that unencrypted packet along to Bob. So that's sort of how packets are sent. Let's look at what each party in this circuit actually knows. We know that Alice knows everything, but that's not really important to us. We know that relay 1 knows that Alice is talking to the Tor network because the relay is part of the Tor network, but relay 1 doesn't actually know who Alice is talking to. It just knows that I have these packets, I'm supposed to forward them to somewhere else in the Tor network. Meanwhile, relay 3, which is the exit node, knows that someone is talking to Bob because I have these packets and ultimately I'm forwarding them to Bob, who's not in the Tor network. But it doesn't know who these packets are coming from. All it knows is I'm getting these packets from somewhere else and decrypting them and seeing, oh, this packet goes to Bob. In the middle, relay 2 knows nothing. It knows neither that Alice is talking to the Tor network, nor that someone is talking to Bob through the Tor network. It just knows that someone is using the Tor network. So no, relay 2 here sort of gets the short end of the stick when it comes to information. All right, I know that was a lot, but are there questions on how this works? Why is the default 3 relays? Yes, that's a very good question. Notice, I think your observation here is that with 2 relays, we still have the fact that relay 1 doesn't know who Alice is talking to, and relay 2, I guess, would not know that someone is Alice, right? Yeah. So what we're trying to, I guess in general, the observation is that the more relays you have, the more secure your connection is likely to be. Because if we only have 2 relays, then if I'm operating the exit node, I could just contact the node that I received the packet from, and I can ask, hey, who sent you that packet? And it's more likely that an attacker controls 2 servers than the attacker controls 3 servers. And it's extra easy if the attacker only controls 2 servers, or it's extra easy if the circuit only consists of 2 servers, because the servers can literally just directly contact each other and say, hey, who sent you that packet? Oh, it was Alice. And now we know that Alice is talking to Bob. So in general, the observation is that more relays means it's harder for the attacker. Specifically, 3 was chosen to avoid the fact that relays can directly contact each other. There's sort of an extra party in the middle who doesn't know anything and is likely to be good. Does that answer your question? All right. Cool. All right. When it comes to exit nodes, notice that the exit node can in fact see directly what the message is and who it's going to. So even though the exit node doesn't know the sender, there's still a man-in-the-middle attacker. If Alice is communicating with some server over insecure HTTP and they're using the Tor network, then the exit node is able to see this HTTP traffic. And because they're a man in the middle, they have the ability to modify this traffic as well. Of course, if we're using TLS or HTTPS, the exit node can't see or tamper with this traffic because we're still encrypting that final layer directly to the server. Of course, the exit node still can see that you're talking to some server. The exit node can still see that you're talking to, say, Google, because it knows where Google servers are, but then it wouldn't be able to see that you're specifically saying, oh, I want to upload a YouTube video or change the password to my account. In practice, these exit nodes kind of have a rough time. Administrators of exit nodes will often receive abuse complaints, and that's because it looks like a lot of traffic that is maybe not the most kind is being sent from their network, because it looks like, say, their network is sending death threats and sending, you know, requests for evil information. So oftentimes the administrators will get complaints from users. The users will sometimes complain to the internet service providers of the exit nodes, and they'll complain to the exit nodes. So they'll receive an angry letter like, hey, you're not allowed to use our internet for illegal activities. And as a result, most operators of Tor relays specifically say, hey, I never want to be an exit node. I only want to be an entry node or an intermediate node. And that's understandable, again, because if I were to run an exit node, I'd probably get like threats and complaints from my internet service provider. So I wouldn't want that personally. And the result here is that in Tor, the bottleneck tends to be the bandwidth of the exit nodes, because there are a lot fewer exit nodes than there are internal nodes. So we have a ton of internal bandwidth, but in terms of actually exiting the network, there are a lot fewer people who are willing to risk their own reputation with their ISP in order to run an exit node. I know one of the stories that one of the other instructors for this class will tell is that Nick Weaver, he had a colleague who ran an exit node just as part of research, and the FBI ended up visiting him, presumably because the traffic that came out from his exit node was something that was very illegal. So yeah, basically it can be a rough time if you're running an exit node. All right, so that's sort of at a high level how Tor works. It's simpler than you might have imagined, although it is fairly complex when it comes to actually running the cryptography required in TLS. But let's talk about some of the weaknesses that come when we're using the Tor network. So the main one that you'll hear a lot of people talk about is something called a timing attack. If a network attacker has a full view of the network, it can see like all in the entire internet and every single packet that gets sent from one place to another, then they can see that Alice and Bob are talking to each other. The timing attack here is that, oh, I saw that Alice sent a message and 2 milliseconds later, Bob received a message, and then Bob sent a message, and 2 milliseconds later, Alice received a message, and they can correlate that, oh, this must mean that Alice and Bob are talking to each other. So this is actually pretty easy for some adversary that can see the entire network. You might think, oh, this is horrible. How does Tor defend against this? In reality, Tor does not defend against this. Tor has basically just said, this is outside of our threat model, so we're not going to bother defending against this, because it's a hard adversary to defend against. We only defend against adversaries, local adversaries that have a partial view of the network. So maybe they can see that Alice is sending packets, but they can't see when Bob receives these packets, or vice versa. You could defend against these if you say delayed packets from one, like delayed the timing of packets. And there are other networks that have been constructed in this way, but this violates the performance goal, and Tor is prioritizing performance over security against the global adversary. So Tor is necessarily weak to this timing attack. Another weakness is collusion. So Nicholas, you brought up a very excellent point earlier that 3 relays seems a little excessive, but 3 relays is because it's really easy for 2 relays to work together. So when multiple nodes work together and they're sharing information, we call this collusion. The 2 nodes are colluding with one another. This is considered dishonest behavior because in the Tor network, we're assuming that relays aren't communicating with each other than sending packets. We're assuming they're not sharing information because this would de-anonymize people. So if all nodes in a given circuit are colluding, then we just lost anonymity. We can see that, oh, Alice is talking to node 1, and node 1 is talking to node 2 is not talking to node 3, and node 3 is talking to Bob. And if we own nodes 1, 2, and 3, we basically can see all the traffic that Alice is sending, and we can see that they're communicating with each other. So if all nodes collude, then anonymity is broken. Of course, well, I guess this is not the converse. The inverse of this? I guess it's the inverse, is that if there's at least one node that is honest, then anonymity is preserved. If even just one node in, say, a 3-node circuit is saying, no, I'm not going to share this information with you, then the colluding nodes can't work together because there's a key piece of information that's missing, mainly who is sending packets to the honest node and who is the honest node sending packets to. Otherwise, everything just appears as noise. It's relatively easy for the adversary to form some amount of colluding nodes in Tor's model. They basically can just run a bunch of nodes, and the more nodes they run, the higher the chance that your circuit of 3 nodes by default will include the attacker's nodes. So if, say, there are 200 nodes in the Tor network and the attacker controls 100 of them, then you have a relatively high chance of forming a circuit that is only the attacker's nodes. And if that happens, then the attacker can de-anonymize you. Of course, Tor has more than 200 nodes. They have a lot of nodes. So I guess the first thing is we're assuming that the attacker only ever controls a tiny proportion of the nodes. And we can say, I want extra security. I don't just want 3 nodes. I want to form a circuit of, 5 nodes or 10 nodes. The more nodes we use, the more confident that at least one of them will be honest. So the more confident we can be that they're not all colluding with each other. Of course, we run into a performance penalty when you have a lot of nodes in your circuit. So generally 3 nodes is the good enough standard that we use. And it's the default that's baked into the Tor browser and most implementations of Tor. So, it's the default and it's good enough for 99.99% of cases. Of course, we can still defend against this. So Tor has implemented something called guard nodes. Basically, these are nodes that have a high reputation and they've been around for some time. So remember that the directory keeps track of the list of all relays. And it can see, this relay has been around for a long time and no one has reported it as malicious. So we're going to say it has a high reputation. For clients, we say that they're always going to use a guard node as the entry node. And this guard node is basically going to be the same anytime we connect to the Tor network. So whereas nodes 2 and 3 will change every time as part of the circuit, node 1, your entry node, is always going to be, the same node as before. Now that seems odd, we're going from 3 random nodes down to 2. Why would we do that? Well, the theory here is that first, attackers' nodes are a lot less likely to become guard nodes, especially if, I've just decided I want to attack Alice. I don't have any guard nodes that are under my control. And because clients use the same guard nodes for a long period of time, even if the attacker has control of a guard node, it's still unlikely that anyone's going to switch to that guard node because it's unlikely that anyone switches guard nodes in general. So that's the theory behind guard nodes. In practice, you can't imagine, if it happens that my client chooses a malicious guard node, it's going to use that guard node for a really long period of time, and maybe that could be bad. But in terms of trade-offs, these are the design decisions that Tor has gone with. Can you add a layer of VPN before connecting to the Tor network? You can actually. The general advice you'll actually receive if you try to do this is that you shouldn't, because the VPN becomes basically the VPN becomes your first node and you have an extra hop in your network, but you're always going to use that node and you might not trust a VPN as much as you trust, say, people who are randomly hosting Tor networks. So I guess the theory here is that if you're using a VPN, it's really easy if that VPN also controls some exit nodes in the Tor network. They can easily run a timing attack and de-anonymize you versus guard nodes, which are assumed to have a higher chance of being honest because they've been around for a long time as part of the Tor network. Good question. All right. The final weakness that we'll talk about, and of course there are more weaknesses than this, is that Tor traffic is really obvious. Tor doesn't hide the fact that you're using Tor. So, and the local adversary, even if they can't see, oh, you're talking to Bob, they can see, oh, you're using the Tor network because you're connecting in a way that looks like Tor traffic. The thing about Tor is that it only works if other people are using it. And there's a classic example that gets shared every year. One day, Harvard, I believe they were in their finals week and they received a bomb threat, something about a bomb. And I think it was going to be at the football game that was happening soon. I don't remember off the top of my head. But they receive a bomb threat and it's, everyone is basically instantly concluded that this is because the student does not want to take finals. So they want to try to cause some disruption to get out of finals. And the administrators check their log and they see, oh, at the time this message was sent, there was only one student in the entirety of the Harvard campus that was using Tor. And they happened to be connecting from the library. I wonder who could possibly have sent this message. Because they didn't ask the email company to give the IP because they knew they would just get an IP of a Tor exit node. But since they can see, oh, one student on the Tor network was using Tor, it must have been them. And they searched their computer and they found that they were the ones who sent that bomb threat. So anonymity only works if other people are also using Tor. If you're the only person in the entire world that's using Tor, Tor is not going to help you be anonymous whatsoever. Because of this, because there are more factors that can be used to identify you than just your IP, every Tor browser is configured in a very similar way. So all Tor browsers are using the same set of extensions. They're using the same user agent, which is really just a header that's sent in HTTP. And this is so that all packets that come from any Tor browser look pretty much the same. So it's hard to identify, this packet is coming from Tor browser A and this packet is coming from Tor browser B because of some difference. They all look the same. Tor browsers will also have tracking defenses built in. So they'll typically disallow tracking cookies by default and so on and so forth. And they'll clear all your cookies when you close Tor browsers anyway. So I guess the key here is that Tor by itself is not enough for anonymity. You need other measures on top of it in order to be fully anonymous. And we'll get into this more in a future slide as well. How do we defend against this? Well, there are some defenses. So there's something called Tor bridges. One of the reasons attackers can tell that you're using Tor is because the list of relays in Tor is public. Remember that there's a directory out there that lists all of the Tor relays that a user could possibly use. If someone sees, oh, you're connecting to a Tor relay, they can just see, oh, it's because you're connecting to an IP that is listed on this public directory. So bridges are a defense against this. They're basically entry nodes that aren't available on any public list. Instead of just being publicly available on a directory, users have to specifically request bridges from a separate bridges directory. And this bridges directory won't list every single bridge that exists. When you ask it, it'll only give you, say, 3 bridges that you can use, and the rest of them remain completely unknown to you. As a result, there's no publicly available list of all bridges, And this makes it harder for administrators to block Tor, because now administrators can't just block all of the Tor IP addresses. There are some out there that they don't know about. However, they can still see that this traffic looks like Tor traffic, and it's because Tor has specific nuances to its traffic that make it different from, say, standard HTTPS or email protocol things or SSH or so on and so forth. So the defense that we've implemented on top of bridges is something called pluggable transports. Now, this is a fancy word. You don't need to remember this fancy word. Pluggable just means that you can substitute one transport for another, and transport just means that it's the communication protocol with the first node. So pluggable transports, their overarching idea is change the appearance of the client's traffic to the entry node. So instead of making it look clearly like Tor traffic, just make it look like, say, standard web traffic or so on and so forth. The technical term that you'll use is obfuscation. We say that it obfuscates the encrypted traffic to make it look more like normal web traffic. And this has there are several techniques here, and we can definitely talk about them afterwards if you're curious about them. But the overarching idea is make it look like normal web traffic to make it harder to distinguish and make it harder to block. All right. Questions on weaknesses? All right, it is 4:26, and we're, I think, making pretty good time for this lecture. So why don't we take a 4-minute break until 4:30, and we will come back then. Okay, so that was Tor, and sort of the basics of the Tor network. We're actually going to talk a little bit about Tor onion services. So, oh no, there are no animations on this slide. It's okay. Sometimes we don't just want the client to be anonymous. We also want the server to be anonymous. So you can think about your own reasons why you might want a server to not know where it's actually located. But when a server runs these services, we call these Tor onion services. Again, they used to be called hidden services, and they're only accessible through the Tor network. It's not possible to connect to them directly through a standard web browser. This gives the server anonymity protection, and when we refer to the more illegal things of onion services, we usually call this the dark web. The big idea for how any of this actually works is just to route the server's traffic through the Tor network so that no one knows who the server is. So before, we were routing the client's communications through the Tor network, and then from there connecting directly to the server. Instead, what we're going to do is route both the client's and the server's traffic through this Tor network, and then we need some way of connecting those two pipes, basically. So the rest of these, like how many? 20 slides, or give or take, are going to be blue. So the specifics of how onion services are actually implemented isn't going to be in scope, but I just thought it was interesting, so I threw it in there. So, because why not? So remember, first of all, we need some way of identifying this server, but if you recall, standard domain names translate to IP addresses, and IP addresses won't work for us because we need server anonymity. If we just got the server's IP, that would instantly de-anonymize the server because the ISP knows who that IP belongs to. Instead, what we're going to do is identify servers using the hash of the service's public key. And this is encoded as a .onion address. So one example is PWOAH7F FOA, etc., so on and so forth. This is complete nonsense, but that makes sense because this is a hash of some public key. Now, at some point, you might come across Facebook core wwwi.onion. And you might ask yourself, this is supposed to be a hash. How does it look so human readable? And the reality is that if you brute force enough public keys, you will eventually find something that hashes to something that happens to start with Facebook and ends in something human readable. So Facebook basically just used a lot of computing power to brute force until they found a key that had a hash that they liked. So this is something that you can do yourself, although you probably won't get so many bits to be exactly what you want them to, because these keys are 2048, 4096 bits long. When we actually connect to the services, it's going to be a little bit more involved because we can't just contact the server after the initial hop. Sorry, I just realized there's a question in the chat. So do the people running the relays get paid by someone? What's their motivation for running the relays? So anyone's allowed to spin up a relay. I could do that myself on my home network if I really wanted to, although I don't really want to. No one's paying them. It's really volunteer driven. So it's the same reason why someone might contribute to open source software, even though no one's paying someone to contribute to open source software. They are contributing it because they believe in the values of free and open source software. And in the same way, someone might run a Tor relay just because they believe in the values of anonymity, censorship resistance, and so on and so forth. And Tor does have a couple of relay, like the Tor project, which is in charge of Tor, does have their own relays as well, of course, but the majority of Tor bandwidth is run by volunteers. Yep. All right, so first, how do we connect to servers? The server has a bit of legwork that they need to put in first in order to even be able to contact them. So what we are going to say is that first, the server chooses some set of nodes, and those nodes are going to be introduction points. So keep that word in mind, they're introduction points, and they form a Tor circuit with each of them. So they are going to go through that whole 3-hop process and end at the introduction point. Once it's formed all of these circuits, it's just going to keep them around for a while. It's going to take the server's public key itself, the introduction points, and it's going to publish them to some publicly available directory. So don't worry about this directory too much. It's set up such that no one actually knows the full list of services in something called a distributed hash table. But the basic takeaway from that is that you need to come across the onion address through some other means. There's no like publicly available list of onion addresses. You have to get them through some other ways. Maybe a friend sent it to you, or maybe there's some Wikipedia article out there with famous onion addresses. You can't just look for a list of them directly from the Tor network. So what does this look like? The server has chosen 2 relays in this case, relay I1, I2. These are the introduction points. It's going to form a full Tor relay with these relays, a Tor circuit with these relays. So I've sort of replaced the tunnels with arrows here because otherwise this diagram would get far too messy. But now the server has persistent connections to both of these introduction points. Now it knows what these introduction points are, so it's going to take its public key and the introduction points and publish them to this public directory. Let's just say that the hash for this public key is something, and it knows, okay, the public key is this, and these are my introduction points. Now that this is publicly available information, the client can actually connect to the server. So first, the client's going to query the directory, and it's going to say, hey, I want to connect to, blah, 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 hash of blah, 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 blah. Can I get the key, please? And the introduction point. So it's going to query the table and receive the full public key, not just its hash, and the introduction points. There could be 5, 10 introduction points. So the client's just going to choose one of them and form a Tor circuit with this introduction point. Once it's formed this connection, the client is now going to choose yet another relay. That's going to be called the rendezvous point, and a secret that is going to be used to communicate with the server. Both of these are encrypted, and it's going to be sent to the introduction point, which both the client and the server are now connected to. And the instruction point is going to forward it on to the actual server. These pieces of information are encrypted with the server's public key. So the introduction point doesn't know what the rendezvous point or the secret is. It just knows that it needs to forward it along to the server. Finally, now that both the client and the server know this rendezvous point, they're going to form a Tor circuit with their rendezvous point, perform a TLS handshake so that we have a completely end-to-end secure channel. And then the server, as a way of proving that it is in fact the server, will send the decrypted secret to the client and authenticate itself. So what this looks like is now this key is published in the table. First, the client just queries the table to get the actual public key and the introduction points. It's going to choose one of them. So let's just say it's chosen relay I1. It forms a circuit to relay I1. And it says, okay, now I need to choose some rendezvous point out there. Let's say it's chosen this point here. This is just reused from earlier because I've run out of points, but this is something that could actually happen in the real world. The client has chosen this relay, relay R, as the rendezvous point, and has chosen some secret. So now it's sending this message, rendezvous at R, and my secret to you is K, and it's all encrypted under the server's public key PK. This is sent to the introduction point. The introduction point forwards it on to the actual server. The server receives this message through the introduction point, through its relays, and it sees, okay, someone wants to communicate with me. They want to rendezvous at relay R, and the secret word that they've given to me is K. They can decrypt this message because they have the secret key associated with this public key. All right, we'll get rid of all this for now because it's getting really complicated really quickly. But the next thing that's going to happen is that the client knows the rendezvous point, so it's going to form a relay to that rendezvous point. So let's just say it's formed another circuit like that. And the server knows, okay, the client wants to rendezvous with me at this rendezvous point. So now it's going to form its own circuit like that. And now notice we have yet another full connection to the server. We had the first one that was through the introduction point, but we don't want to reuse that because multiple clients might use that at the same time. So each client chooses a different rendezvous point, and now they have a full connection. Finally, the server says, okay, we're going to form a handshake, and then I can prove to you that I am in control of the secret key because I know what the decrypted secret word is. So I send a message that says the secret that was encrypted is K, and that makes its way all the way back to the client. Notice that the client and the server are never directly communicating with each other. Both of these are just talking through this intermediate rendezvous point. So the client doesn't actually know where the server is located in the world, and the server doesn't actually know where the client is located in the world. They're both anonymous to each other. All right. Questions on this? I know this is a lot of hops and a lot of arrows, but are there any questions on how this works? All right. So now we've fully anonymized the server, and these are called truly hidden onion services. Tor has anonymity guarantees for the client at all times. And in this case, we've just extended this to the server by saying, okay, now not only is the client going to connect to the server through Tor, but both the client and the server are going to connect to Tor, and they're going to just speak through some rendezvous point such that neither entity knows who the other party is. Of course, there's a performance impact. Now, instead of 3 nodes here, we're going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nodes to send our traffic. So there's definitely going to be a huge performance impact. And this has given rise to something called non-hidden onion services. So this seems a little bit counterintuitive to begin with, but give me a moment to explain and it'll hopefully make sense. The server can say, I don't actually care about being anonymous. I just want to connect through a rendezvous point at all times instead of being directly connected to. And this means that there's no more anonymity for the server, but it means that now you only have 3 nodes, and I'll get into this diagram in a moment. And it means that we're not using exit nodes anymore, because typically the exit node connects directly to the service. But if the service is still saying, I'm just going to connect into the cloud, and then some other services, and then some clients can connect through me, through a rendezvous point, then you're not using the bandwidth of the exit nodes. So you can tend to get better performance if you're using non-hidden onion services. And you no longer have to rely on this exit node thing because all onion services are end-to-end encrypted by default. It's just part of the traffic. It's just part of the protocol. So even if you're not using HTTPS, you still have this end-to-end encryption. I'll go through the diagram first, and I'll go back to the last point on that. So this is the same diagram as before, except instead of connecting to the rendezvous point through another Tor circuit, it's just the server has just decided I can connect directly to the rendezvous point and communicate with the client. The server still doesn't know who the client is because the client's still using 3 relay points here. But the server has just decided I don't care about anonymity. And this is useful for services that also happen to have an onion alternative. So something like Facebook. Facebook doesn't care about hiding where its servers are. We know where Facebook servers are. They're everywhere. But maybe they still want to connect through the Tor network, so they have their Onion service. DuckDuckGo has something like this available as well. So if you have used DuckDuckGo, you might have come across its Onion URL, and that is the same thing. It's just that instead of connecting through an exit node in this network, it can connect directly through a rendezvous point. And this rendezvous point can be any node in the network. So we're not relying on exit nodes anymore. All right. We're almost to the end. Questions on hidden services? Or Onion services, I keep saying that. All right. So that is sort of the high level theory on how all of Tor works. Most of Tor anyway. Let's talk a bit about how it's actually used in practice. So of course, as with any security tool, there are trade-offs. One of the major benefits of Tor is that it's free to use. It's open source software. Anyone can look at the source code. Anyone can download and compile it. And it's free for anyone to use. You don't have to pay like a $10 subscription fee per month to use Tor. It happens to be that Tor is mostly funded by the US government. So if you're super paranoid, this might be off-putting to you. But it is developed out in the open, and the papers that define all the Tor specifications are available for free use. So I would say it's not too much of a point of concern, but if you do care about motivations and maybe they've backdoored it, then that could be something you want to think about. Users, because they're not paying for the Tor network, instead they're paying by providing anonymity to other users. Remember, you need other people using Tor in order to actually have anonymity. So by providing your own traffic to be part of the Tor network, you are helping other users to hide in the crowd because you're making the crowd larger, basically. Of course, as a drawback, exit nodes are a man-in-the-middle attacker, so you need to trust this exit node, although to be fair, the regular internet is also full of men in the middle? Huh, okay, I've never tried to pluralize that. The regular internet is full of these attackers, so whether this is that important is technically debatable. Yeah, men in the middle, I'm not sure. And of course, you have the performance drawback, which is that you have to connect through 3 nodes. So you'll have a lot higher latency because even though Tor is meant to be a low latency network, it's still higher latency than just directly connecting to your server. Finally, this full anonymity is going to require significant usability trade-offs. Remember that all Tor browsers have to be configured the same way in order for all traffic to look the same. If your traffic looks different than other Tor users' traffic, then people can start to de-anonymize you. So all Tor browsers will have the exact same configuration and they won't save your history. So if you've ever used the Tor browser before, you may have noticed every time I close this browser, it forgets everything I've ever done, which is good from a security perspective, but it's annoying from a usability perspective because I like to have my search history saved locally on my client, not by the search engine itself, of course, but it's still annoying. So this is something that you have to think about when you're using Tor. One of the more extreme examples of how they make sure that every Tor browser is the same is that they recommend keeping the browser window size constant. If you've ever opened Tor browser, you'll see it's in this like odd 3:2 or 2:3 resolution or aspect ratio. And if you try to resize it, you'll get this warning of, hey, people can see that you've changed your window size. They might be able to tell, hey, this user is using a 16:9 aspect ratio, and this traffic coming out the other end is also 16:9, so that must be you. So it's annoying because it's a weird aspect ratio, and it highlights that Tor comes with a lot of usability trade-offs. So it's really up to your threat model whether you want to use Tor or not versus a simple proxy or VPN. The most noble reason that Tor cites for its existence is censorship resistance. So because Tor hides the sites a user is connecting to, it's useful for bypassing censorship. It's similar to how you'd use a VPN or proxy, but it's more effective because it sort of built on the fact that you don't actually have to trust anyone, not even the Tor network itself. Sensors, of course, can easily block access to public Tor entry points. This is where the bridges come in because they're entry points that aren't publicly listed anywhere. Of course, sensors can block traffic that looks like Tor traffic, and this is where pluggable transports come in because it makes it look more like normal web traffic. Of course, in response, sensors can pretend to be a Tor client, and they basically see, oh, Alice is connecting to this server over here. I'm going to try to connect to it myself and see if it's a Tor node. And if it is, it'll know, okay, Alice is connecting to the Tor network and block that connection. Even more recent pluggable transports will distribute a shared secret that's not known to these fake clients, so they can't form the connections themselves. Some rely on cloud services, so they basically say, if you're blocking these entry points, you have to block the entirety of, say, Google or Amazon or Microsoft or GitHub. So it really, it sort of forces their hand. Do they care more about blocking Tor, or do they care more about keeping services like GitHub or Google or so on and so forth? So it increases the collateral damage, so to speak. You may notice there's this huge back and forth between sensors and Tor. And as Perrin highlighted yesterday, or day before yesterday, this is basically an arms race between Tor, which is aiming to resist censorship, and sensors who are censoring. Now, when you hear Tor, the thing that you probably hear about most often is the fact that you host illegal services on Tor. And because of the way Tor is constructed, this is more or less true. Onion services are often used for services that are basically illegal anywhere in the world. If you are running one of these services, you'll never be able to get something like Cloudflare to host your site for you because it's completely illegal, and Cloudflare would get shut down for hosting these services. Most countries would take legal action against these services if they're hosted on the regular web, which is why they sort of have to be forced underground, so to speak, and be hosted on Tor instead. Dark markets is the term for when you have marketplaces that are on Tor and they're used for buying and selling illegal goods. You can imagine what illegal goods might be sold, but the transactions on these dark markets tend to be through something like Bitcoin, since that's decentralized. We talked about that. Must have been 4 weeks ago by now, something crazy like that. Because they are selling illegal goods, they can't use something like PayPal because they will also refuse to process illegal transactions. They'll also have a couple of other illegal schemes, such as requiring you to leave good feedback, or just other illegal things that I won't get into. And the key is, because everything that they do is completely illegal, they will only ever be on Tor, because if they're on Tor, no one can see where these servers are actually hosted, so no one can shut them down, basically. The other main class of sites that we'll talk about are cybercrime forums. So there are sites out there which are like Reddit, they're forums, except they're used to talk about completely illegal things. And again, you can use your imagination to what these things would be. So there is a really long and tangled and dark history about dark markets. The first one that cropped up on the dark web is something called the Silk Road. This was founded in 2001 as basically a marketplace where there's no such thing as rules. And if there's no such thing as rules, very quickly you'll see that illegal activities take place. So the primary purpose for the Silk Road was to buy and sell illegal drugs. It was taken down in October 2013. You can read the story on how they actually discovered the location of the Silk Road servers and who ran it. Its founder was arrested, and nowadays most markets are going to follow this same template. So they sell drugs because usually those are the most illegal products around the world. Generally, they are certain classes of drugs such as marijuana, MDMA, stimulants, opioids, psychedelics, all things that I'm obviously not familiar with. And most of the revenue for these markets is actually just a few major sellers at a few major markets. So usually individuals won't actually have that much success in buying products from these dark markets. Instead, they're just large buyers and sellers, say, I don't know, cartels and so on and so forth. Very quickly, you see that because of the framework that Tor provides of providing full anonymity for services, if one of these markets is taken down, another one will just crop up really quickly. So it's really hard to shut down these dark markets now that Tor has been invented. Nowadays, it is really hard to figure out where dark markets are located because of the guarantees of Tor and the not dark web. So basically the part of the internet you can access with your regular browser has basically decided that we're not going to associate with the dark web at all. So something like Reddit will take down dark market links. It'll take down onion links basically in their entirety. And legitimate websites do their best to just take down any information about the dark web because they just don't want to be caught or seen facilitating this kind of activity. If you want to connect to dark markets, obviously, just for research purposes, there are repositories of publicly known onion addresses that are available through other onion services. So there's a service called Dread. This is basically just a dark web clone of Reddit. And here you can find, lists of onion links, but again, I wouldn't exactly recommend doing that. Yeah, at this point, I'm not actually sure how to present these slides. These are all mainly information. This is all mainly information that we've taken from Nick's slides that we meant to keep in. But darker markets are usually going to include the volume of their sales during the mandatory reviews. So we can estimate the size of most dark markets. They tend to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and closer to millions of dollars today. So I guess I don't even know what the takeaway here is supposed to be. They're profitable if you are okay with illegal activity, but the trade-offs of having your door kicked down by some investigative agency is probably too high for most people. It's not growing, and that's probably a good thing. On the dark market, there tend to be a lot of scams because there is no regulation. There are no defenses for the consumer. So there's, the idea is if a market scams people, their reputation will go down, but it's still not as great as actually taking down fraudulent websites and refunding their customers. So there have been, and there continue to be, things called exit scams. The idea here is, okay, we're a really well-known market, known to be reputable, but we don't really care anymore. So we're just going to sacrifice our reputation for short-term profit. What we'll do is, we'll legitimately sell things. People will say, hey, this is a good dark market that you can use to buy whatever illegal things that your heart desires. And what you'll do is say, hey, now we're holding a big sale and you can buy anything that you want. And, you have to finalize your transactions early because we're going to run out of stock otherwise. And the moment they do that, they say, okay, now we're going to just take your money and run because you can't find us. So there's no way that you'll actually ever be able to recover your money. Sometimes they have to bypass, certain checks. There are third parties that will hold your money until you make sure that you've gotten your product. But the basic key is once you have a good reputation, you take everyone's money at once and run with it. And there have been entire markets whose entire existence is just scams. The most famous of this is the sheep marketplace, but we won't get into that too much. All right. That was a really odd way to end the, I guess not in scope content because it was all blue, but a really odd way to end the last in scope lecture for the semester. But to summarize, anonymity is the concealing of an individual's identity, but it's hard to achieve on the web. We can achieve this in part using proxies and VPNs, basically relaying our traffic through a single machine, but this single machine still knows who you are and who you're connecting to. So we don't say that this is fully anonymous. By contrast, Tor is going to route your traffic through multiple machines. So I send my traffic to relay A, which sends it to B, to C, and then to my final destination. And the idea is no one machine knows both who you are and what you're doing. We established these circuits using nested TLS handshake, and we noticed that exit nodes can be a man in the middle because they are the final relay. So if you're using unencrypted HTTP, they can probably modify and tamper with your traffic. There are certain weaknesses to the Tor network. The main one is timing attacks, which allows global adversaries to see when your packets are exiting and entering and exiting the Tor network. And this could allow you to see, oh, Alice sent a packet and Bob just received a packet. So they're probably talking to each other. Tor doesn't defend against this, so it's sort of something that you have to deal with. It also doesn't defend against collusion very well. So if multiple word nodes are malicious and they work together, then they can de-anonymize users. And because Tor traffic looks different from normal traffic, it's relatively easy to censor it, although there are bridges and pluggable transports that make life more difficult for censors. Onion services build on top of the Tor network by saying the server is not, or not only is the client going to connect to the Tor network and speak to the server through this 3-hop construct, the server is also going to do this as well, and they're going to rendezvous in the middle of the Tor network so that neither the client nor the server know who each other are. In practice, we do get anonymity guarantees from the Tor network, although we also have the additional potential for man-in-the-middle attacks, performance and usability trade-offs. Today, Tor is often used to evade censorship, and Tor is largely used for illegal services. So there have been good and bad things. The noble reasons that people use Tor is because of censorship resistance, and I think that is ultimately a good thing. But as a result, it has also created and fostered a lot of illegal activity that happens on the internet. All right, that was, again, a really odd way to end the final lecture, but that is officially all that we have for you. So are there any final questions? I see someone is saying this class has made them a lot more paranoid, which I'm not sure if paranoid is the right word, but I think having a security mindset is definitely beneficial in life, especially as a computer scientist. All right, if there are no other questions, I will see people on Monday if they want to come to the optional lectures. And if not, I will see you during the final. See you, everyone.